Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. Today, James is with me and our friend and former guest again, Amy Mantravadi, author of a new book, Face to Face, a novel of the Reformation. How are you doing today, Amy?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. We had a couple days here where it actually was starting to snow and look very, like dead of winter like. And now we're back to autumn, which is kind of nice because I wasn't quite ready for that
You're
yet.
in Ohio, right?
Yes, a couple times a year, Canada's air will kind of get lost and wander down here, and we'll just suddenly get absolutely frigid. And it's like, I told one of my Canadian friends, I'm like, please come get your ear back. We've enjoyed it, but it needs to go home now. And that has happened. So, we everything's as it should be.
Hopefully our Canadian listeners didn't tune out. No, I'm kidding. But it's true. When I'll go, because I have most of my family's in the north, when I go there or I come back here and we happen to have like a cool or a chill like down here right after I get back, there's always the joke that I brought the weather. Of course, the people down here are thankful when it gets cool like it is right now
Mm.
down here in Louisiana. Well, anyways, yeah, Amy, thank you for being here. Amy's back for our listeners on her second of the two-part series that she wrote, these two historical fiction novels, which is an interesting genre because it's like we're talking about people who are real, situations that were real, but using, like historical fiction, she uses the her imagination to imagine what the dialogue looked like and how exactly these things transpire. So I enjoyed this book. Just to say for our guests a little more about Amy, she's a regular contributor over at 1517.org. And she's also the author of another set of books, three-part historical novels called The Chronicle of Maud, which is centered on Empress Matilda, who, of course, was the Holy Empress the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy, neither Roman, nor an empire. I don't know much about Matilda or those. Do you mind like telling us just a quick plug in if you want? I don't know how long ago you wrote that series, but yeah, I know you weren't
I
coming
would
on to
be
talk
happy to
about that.
talk. I would be happy to talk about it, but I do have to cry foul immediately because it was it was definitely an empire. I mean, there's no other way around it. It was definitely Roman, and I think you could definitely argue that it was holy. So you are just at this point accepting what Voltaire says as gospel, which is kind of shocking for a minister of the church.
Uh,
She's
I'll
got you, Drew. I
I'll
mean,
argue on the holy part, but I'll concede the other two.
I admit the holy is sort of the most dubious,
Yeah,
but we'll set that to aside
to
before I go
put
on
it
a longer
lightly.
rant. So Empress Matilda, I first got an interest in writing long form fiction to tell the story of Empress Matilda of England. And in order to help situate people, I always say her grandfather was William the Conqueror and her grandson was Richard the Lionheart. So this is around the time of the Crusades. If you think of like Robin Hood, that's slightly after this time,
Mhm.
if he had been a real person, which he maybe wasn't. Um, if you've seen the movie The Lion in Winter, that's Henry II, her son, who Thomas Becket was murdered during his reign. So, but what basically happens is Matilda's father and grandfather and other ancestors are all kings of England, but her father dies without a legitimate male heir.
Hmm.
So that means that he had actually wanted his one surviving legitimate child, his daughter, to become Queen Regnant of England. But the problem was that although all the nobles of the land and all the bishops of the church all swore that they were going to do this before he died, they pulled a major take backsies after he croaked. And poor Matilda was stuck in what's now central France with her husband, who she hated, who her father had married her off to. She was very pregnant. She couldn't just rush off to London and get crowned. So her cousin, very opportunistically, went and got his brother, who was the Bishop of Winchester, because, everything was just very, kind of corrupt and political in those days, unlike today, of course. He went and he got his brother to give him, the keys to the treasury, and he got the support of the business people in London, who were motivated mainly by wanting to have lower taxes. Again, totally unlike anything today. We would never have rich business people affecting politics to try to get lower taxes for themselves. So this is how there ended up being a civil war between Matilda and her cousin. And this was the first of 3 civil wars that England has had since Norman conquest. This one was called the Anarchy because it was a time, supposedly, according to the chronicler of the time, Henry of Huntington, he said it was a time when Christ and his saints slept, because that was how bad. It was kind of like in the Judges, where everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Basically, because there was this political chaos, anyone who wanted to just nick something from somebody else could steal it. And, there wasn't, chaos was kind of reigning. So the second Civil War was the War of the Roses, and the third is the one that we call the English Civil War. So anyway, I just thought that was such an interesting story. I first found out about Empress Matilda when I was researching my family history and realized I was descended from her. That's not impressive. There are millions of people who are descended from her, but it made me wonder, who is that
Probably
person?
like all 3 of us, but
Yeah.
no, it's
So,
it's still an exciting find nonetheless, and it's cool that it prompted you to then research and know her story.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that was really a process of me learning how to write novels. So
Yeah.
what I always tell people is they get better as they go along.
How
By
long
the
ago
time I
was
got to
that when you wrote?
yeah, there are the 3 books. They get bigger as they go along, but they also get better.
How long
And
ago was that when you wrote those?
okay, so it was in my late 20s that I started that project.
Oh, okay.
So I think 2017 was when the first one came out.
And I didn't
And the
ask your
last
age,
one,
but you volunteered that, so I'm kidding.
yeah, the last one I finished up during 2020 during COVID.
Okay.
So, um,
That's a good time to finish
yeah.
projects during COVID. Well, no, well, listeners, heck, I've not read it either. Chronicles of Maud. That was her Amy's first novel's 3-part series for everyone to know. You got a little bit there about that. So, and while we're on it, we will then get to the topic of today's episode, which is Amy's of course the second of her Reformation novel series. This one is called Face to Face. And Amy, before we get in out of the new book, I want to look back briefly quick on the first book, which we had you on for. I think it was January, February. The first book was, of course, called Broken Bonds, and I'm curious to know what kind of reception it has had, because in my corner of the woods, or corner of the wherever, but I've seen some people praise it. I think it would probably lend itself to a good book study at a church. I haven't heard of any churches using it, but I think it would be good for that. Then of course in my case it was fun personal reading, but you know what I liked about it is that I've come to know, the story of Luther originally through like a couple of like actual biographies and then like primary works, and which are like mainly letters and sermons and treatises and stuff like that. And as a doctoral student studying Luther, like, that's how I'm used to getting them through that type of medium. Um, you know, but to see a dramatic depiction in the form of a novel with like character dialogue, you know, that I think like Luther's story, I'm surprised. I don't know if there's other Luther novels out there, but his story does so much lend itself. I mean, obviously they've made films about him, but it so much lends itself to this kind of medium. But I guess just to sum of what I'm saying, reading your first book and then this book was kind of a nice, it was a nice break from study. um, and not, it's just something I could just enjoy. I mean, of course I enjoy study too, but you know what I mean? I could just be more passively just take it in like a show or a movie, or right, or like a fiction novel, right? So I'm just saying, as someone who as a Luther student, I suppose it was nice to do it in a different mode. And have you gotten, I'm wondering if you've gotten like, have you gotten similar comments from others who like formally have studied Luther, or maybe even like a Luther scholar or a theologian or something, but they read your book and it was a nice kind of different thing for them to do. I don't know what does that make sense?
Yeah, I have been hearing that from people. Now, in terms of the response to the book, I mean, I'm not challenging John Grisham or J.K. Rowling for top of the worldwide fiction charts, but sort of within the circle of people here in the US who are really interested in the Reformation, it's had a very good reception. I have had some groups who are doing it for group studies. I've already done a Q&A with one of them, and I do offer that. If you have a book club or anything that read the book,
Mhm.
I will endeavor to do a 1 hour video Q&A with you. So that offer is out there. I also was just contacted this week by a professor who wants to use one or both of the books in her church history
Oh,
course.
really?
So
That's awesome.
yeah,
Uh,
that was pretty awesome. So and I think I understand what you're saying about the change of pace, because of course part of why I wrote these books are, although I was able to get through reading Martin Luther's Bondage to the Will and found it an edifying experience, I know that most people are never going to pick that book up. I was just at 1517's annual conference in San Diego, which was all the theme of it was all around Luther's Bondage to the Will. And we had a range of different kinds of presentations there, and I enjoyed all of them. But I did hear from a few people who were like, this is all a little academic for me.
mhm.
I'm not sure I could really pick up and go through the Bondage of the Will. And, I would talk to them about my book, and they say, your book sounds like something that would be accessible for me. I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
that's kind of the idea, because the bar to entry is lower on purpose. That doesn't mean it's dumbed down, because
No.
I think there is lots of detail there, but it's
Th-
I try to make it not
yeah.
overwhelming for the reader. And the thing is, it needs to be just an entertaining story. It can't just be a theology lesson.
Right.
So I've tried to do that, to make it actually to like that it can stand on its own just as a good story, and not simply as trying to present theological ideas. Although it does that. But yeah, and in terms of previous depictions of Luther, there have been a few novels about him, and I haven't read them all. But I know none of them have really made a huge mark in the market.
Mhm.
And I think the hard thing for me is I don't think I could ever like another novel about Luther, because I know how I think it should be done.
Mhm.
It's so inevitably, I had this same problem with Empress Matilda, because I tried reading another novel about her, and immediately I'm like, that's not how she talks. That's not right. And of course, neither me or this author knew exactly how she talks, because there's just not enough record. But I knew in my head how it was supposed to be. This is why I kind of always feel that Luther scholars are the last people I would want to read my books, because they're going to have a very developed idea in their heads of what Luther should be, or indeed people who study Erasmus or Melanchthon, the other two main characters in the book. But I have had people who very knowledgeable about these things have enjoyed the books. So that's good. And I did, even at that 1517 conference, I had someone ask me, they're like, is there anything as part of this process that you feel like you made any kind of new discoveries about Luther at all? And Luther is one of the most studied people in history. There's no shortage of research about him. He's left no shortage of letters behind. So there's not a lot of new ground to be covered. But I did give one little anecdote about how when I was writing these books, I initially used an editor who I just hired and work with here in Dayton. She's another fiction author. And she read through these books knowing like absolutely nothing about the Reformation as far as I could tell. And we got to the point where we're partway through the second book, and spoiler, Luther gets married. I mean, that's not a big spoiler because we all know what happens. And Erasmus, we know from his letters, was telling people that Katie Luther had been pregnant at the time they were married, and that she gave birth to a baby soon after they were married, and that people saw her like walking around with the baby.
Which wasn't the case, to be clear for listeners who may not know. It was not the case.
Yeah, this was not the case. This was true. And this was false. And when you read that, you just assume, oh, well, some people are just making this up, because we know it's not true, because we have the records of when she had a child, and it would not work with that timing. But my editor, reading through this, at this time, Luther's sort of frenemy, Karlstadt, was staying with them at their house, along with the Karlstadt family was staying there.
Mm-hmm.
And my editor said, oh, so people saw the Karlstadt baby and thought that it was Luther's baby, right? I'm like, I never thought about that before. Like, yes, because Katie was helping to care for the Karlstadt baby, and someone walking by could have seen her carrying the baby. I never would have.
Yeah, that's
and it's one of those things that, like, I feel like it took someone who doesn't really know anything about the subject to make that observation. So
isn't that odd how it works out? Like
things like that. Yeah.
Isn't it odd how that works out? Like we who have such strong interest in it form blind spots. I don't know if maybe we do, maybe we don't, but like someone who has no familiarity, they're just looking this like they would look like if any two different sets of a family living under a roof. Oh, people are going to wonder if this is that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And it's what I see as one advantage of doing what I have done, which is instead of just focusing on what Erasmus is doing or what Luther is doing or what Melanchthon is doing, we're putting the timelines one on top of each other. And that at least allowed me to get a much better understanding of the situation, because I'm looking at what Erasmus is writing in his letters at the same time as Luther's doing something else, as Melanchthon is doing something else. And it allowed me to make some connections in terms of motivation and things like that, that I think, usually probably the greatest tendency among people of our sort of denominational background is to focus on Luther and not to really be paying much attention to what Erasmus is doing, except, if it directly involves Luther. But when you start looking at the fact that, for instance, Erasmus was getting threatened with being put on trial for heresy at the very time that this controversy is happening, it starts to make part of his motivation clear. And I wouldn't have really put that together until I'd started going through all of his letters in addition to all of Luther's letters. So, yeah.
I bet I never even, for storytelling, I imagine if layering the timelines like that can be very helpful. But gosh, even for academic study, I wouldn't be surprised at all how much we could probably afford to do that more, just to understand, fuller context of things. But well, I like what you said a moment ago about the accessibility factor with your book. I think you were talking about there was a conference that was all about bondage of the will, and that writing, that's probably a little more obtuse for people, not obtuse, but that's probably a little more inaccessible for people than what was my big life changing Luther writing, that I read years ago, which was his commentary on Galatians.
Mhm.
And even that one, sometimes when I'm kind of hesitant to share my my testimony about how much of a good effect that book had on me, because then it's like, then they're like, oh, someone might think, well, I should go check that out. It's like, well, I think in excerpts and snippets, uh, it's great, but I mean, it is kind of a tome, and Bondage of the Will even more so. Um,
Mhm.
Bondage of the Will, yeah, I've heard that just people kind of like, wow, it's heavy, it's dense. The but for you, it and you've shared this before, and I really think it comes out in your writing, that writing, especially of any of Luther's works, seemed to have a really big impact on you. Do you mind sharing, like, um just as much as you can, just kind of summarize Bondage of the Will, the main point of it, and why for you that writing was so effective?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And um, if anyone wants to hear like a really long exposition on this, at that conference I just mentioned, I gave a talk called "How the Bondage of the Will Changed My Life,"
Is there a
and
video of that?
it should be up by the end of the month. They're putting
Okay.
the videos from the conference out, and never the one every few days to kind of give them content over the course of a while. But I think by the end of the month they should
Okay.
be posting that on the official 1517 YouTube channel.
On the 15th.
So
Okay.
everyone is welcome to view that.
Yeah. And as that
So
time comes, I will edit the show notes on here to have a link for that. But if you're
that
listening
would be
before then,
great.
sorry, but if you're
Yeah.
listening before then, know to be on the lookout. Anyways, I'm sorry, Amy,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I would say the bondage of the will, the the typical one sentence headlines, it's debate over whether human beings have free will in terms of salvation, whether we can on our own choose to follow God, choose to repent and have work up faith in God and ourselves. And Erasmus is going to make the case that he writes a book first called The Freedom of the Will, in which he says what is a pretty standard Catholic position, or it hadn't really been codified in Catholic doctrine yet, but it would be a few decades later at the Council of Trent, which is that yes, obviously grace is necessary for salvation, but there's an element of cooperation between the human will and between God and what he's doing, so that we can say that there is free will in regard to salvation, even though you do need grace in order to fully complete the task of the Christian life and be justified before God. There is an element, maybe only like 1%, that you can say, I did this,
Mm.
and Erasmus feels that's necessary for us to have, or we are just, well, he wouldn't say we're robots, but whatever the 16th century version of that was, we're just machines. We
Puppets.
are, he thinks that throws us into a kind of pagan fatalism,
Mm.
and which I would say they're actually two very different things, but he was into the pagan classics, so of course his mind went that way. And also, he thinks that's very negative because it makes God into a monster. Basically, God's just choosing that he's not going to save a bunch of people, and tough nuggies.
Mm.
And Luther is going to come out and he argues in The Bondage of the Will that we cannot freely of our own will choose to follow God. We cannot truly make ourselves righteous because of the curse of sin. Adam and Eve originally had free will when they were created, but because of the choice they made to sin, and because of the original sin that we all now inherit, we are born in bondage to sin, and we actually need God to come in and resurrect us spiritually. We need him to break those bonds for us, because otherwise it would be like what Erasmus actually uses, this interesting phrase in his book. He's talking about how God commands a lot of things in scripture. And he says, isn't this like saying to someone who's bound in chains that you have to get up and, walk? Wouldn't that, Luther, isn't that what you're saying? That, isn't that what God would be saying if we couldn't really do this? He's telling people to do something they can't accomplish. And Luther says, yeah, he is telling you to do something you can't do. You really are bound in chains. But he's going to say the point of the law in God's word is not to tell us how we can be justified, but to reveal that we never can be justified by following the law. It's basically, it is serving, as Paul says, as a tutor to point us to Christ. The fact that we need salvation coming from outside ourselves. We need Christ to give his righteousness to us. And Luther's going to say Erasmus's big mistake is that he cannot differentiate properly between when God is giving the law and when he's giving the gospel. Luther's going to say that whenever God says, do this and live, or some variation on that in scripture, that is the law. That is telling you what you would have to do on your own in order to be made perfect. And actually, none of us can do it. Which is, if God ever tells you, Luther says, if he just presents something to you and said, this is given to you, this was done for you, that is when you're hearing the gospel. So I would say that that is sort of a basic looking into what the bondage of the will is about. And that was sort of new for me, because growing up, whenever I would hear about election or predestination, I guess I'll just say it was presented in kind of negative way. It was presented only in like a hyper Calvinist way by people who weren't even Calvinists. Like, this is the kind of crazy thing that some people believe. Mm-hmm. And what Luther says, I think his best summation of the bondage of the will comes in the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518, when he says, the love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to it. This idea of God's creative love that comes to the sinner, that comes to a person who is not lovable, who has not done anything righteous, and makes them righteous by giving himself to them. It's Christ for you. And, Robert Kolb has written a book that looks at Luther's bondage to the will, and specifically how it was received in the Lutheran tradition.
Yeah. Bound choice, election.
If you really want to do the deep dive, you need to read that volume by Kolb, the name of which I'm blanking on right now, but
it's called Bound Choice, Election, and the Wittenberg Theological Method. And for listeners, it is indeed a deep dive, and a lot of our listeners probably read it. But
it's great. Yeah. And I couldn't think of the name of it because right now the only Kolb title I have in my head is Face to Face, because that's the name of his most recent book and my most recent book.
Oh, it
and
is.
I said to 1517, is this going to be a problem that we're stealing Dr. Kolb's title? And they said, oh, no, because yours is fiction and his is nonfiction. It'll be fine. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, there's all kinds of like two things with two different names.
And it's a concept that's coming out of scripture and out of Martin Luther's writings, so it's no surprise multiple people would want to use it.
But it did sorry, I promise I did read your book, but why did you title it Face to Face? For me, it conjured up like a feeling of Luther, Erasmus, and the several other central people in the book are really having to come to terms with certain things. They have to face something. Is that what it meant? Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. But,
no, that's okay. So I'll have a little inside baseball moment with you now. So the working title for these two books were Fear and Trembling, parts 1 and 2. And because
you rip off Soren Kierkegaard too. I'm kidding.
Well, I wasn't trying to rip him off. I put that because the verse that probably inspired me more than any other is where Paul says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you to will and to work. And so obviously, they couldn't publish with that title because it is Soren Kierkegaard's title. So we did kind of have a group collaboration, and the where the face-to-face comes from is from an incident that I mentioned in the first novel, which was really important to Luther, which is Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Yeah.
And at the end of this encounter, which Luther sees as symbolic of the life of faith, Jacob says, I've seen God face to face.
Mm.
And this is
Ah,
Luther's whole idea that we're living before the face of God. But then
yeah.
the secondary meaning is that, yeah, Luther's having to face off with Erasmus, Melanchthon at different times, having to, have this face to face encounter with Luther. So there is kind of that dual meaning, even as with Broken Bonds, it sort of was a title
There was,
that,
yeah, because we saw how relationships were at stake, and
yeah.
because of the Reformation, which all of us here would agree, the Reformation was a good thing, but you show, I think, rightly, the ugly side of
Mm.
the turmoil of the times that it did create, kind of like Jesus will divide brother against sister, and all that, like he says in scripture, like the Reformation had that effect. It brought division. And yeah, I think when I saw the title Broken Bonsai, that was kind of my first, you know, that was kind of my first interpretation because it's about those three figures, which of course is continued on in your second book, and how yeah, their relationships were, um like any human relationship, they have their challenges to maintain. But
Mm-hmm.
so, anyways, yeah, well, and so yeah, thanks for sharing about Bondage of the Will. And and I guess what were some other things you researched for I guess both books, but particularly for Face to Face? What were uh some very valuable resources for you as you kind of put this together?
So for this one in particular, I had to do some research on Katharina von Bora, who becomes more of a major player in this book because in 1525 Martin Luther got married. And there are multiple books out, biographies out about her, and of course she's also discussed in a lot of the books about Luther. I found one particularly helpful volume about her that was written by a couple who was, I believe, an LCMS pastor and his wife. I think they've both passed away now, but they're called the Markwalds, was their last name. And they were fluent German speakers. So they actually went to Germany, apparently, and were able to get some of the records from the Marienthron Abbey that Katharina was actually at, the Cistercian nunnery. And they were able to provide details about her life there that I didn't see in any of the other books about her, like
Oh,
what she was eating. And that was real eye-opening because, I mean, I knew that usually people who are in monastic orders are not living high on the hog, but there was a big difference between different orders as to their sort of their principles of living. So the Cistercians that she was part of were highly ascetic. Like, of all the different orders out there, they were the ones that were the harshest in terms of the lifestyle. And so in this book, I looked at what they were getting on a daily basis and sort of added it up, and it was less than 1,000 calories a day.
ooh, wow.
And they're doing manual labor, like from morning till night. And they have a code of silence, absolutely rigidly observed. So they're not allowed to talk to each other verbally at all. They are not allowed to leave or have any contact with outsiders, even when people came to their church, to their little chapel to worship. There was a screen. You cannot interact with the other people. And the more and more I kept going through these, I'm like I knew the life of a nun could be hard, but you're kind of like, okay, I mean, at least they were getting, probably better than some of the peasants were living. And the more I started reading about it, I'm like, this is actually a really terrible, kind of abusive situation. And there are records still showing the there was an abbot from a sort of paired monastery who would supervise over the over the nuns at Marienthron. And he sent two representatives, two monks who were always there. It was just all these women and these two men. And the men were the only ones who had the keys to any of the doors.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that, I was like, this is getting really uncomfortable to me. Because, for instance, I'm friends with Rachel Dunn Hollander, who was the first person to publicly come out and accuse Larry Nassar of the abuse in the USA gymnastics program. So because of knowing her, I've read up a lot on that. And a lot of that abuse took place at a camp in Texas that the girls would go to, where they weren't allowed to call anyone or communicate with their family, where they had very restrictive eating regimen. And they had this one guy who was nice to them when everyone else was yelling at them all day, and they trusted him.
Yeah.
And the more I read it, I'm like, I'm trying not to just read modern experience into it.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'm like, I do not know of any situation like this that does not end up somehow being abusive, where you have people who are basically malnourished. They're basically almost enslaved in this situation. They can't, if they leave, if they try to run away, they're going to get executed. And the more I read about it, I'm like, this is not, there are lots of, okay, I'm a fan of medieval history, and there are lots of forms of medieval monasticism that were not abusive, that were, lots of positive things happened there. But this was not one of those experiences. And it made me think about Katharina differently, because obviously I sympathize with her desire to run away to a place that had better theology, but I now feel like it feels like a prison break or something. It feels like all these women, they had a really miserable existence, an existence that the Catholic Church would never allow now. They would never allow anyone in one of their orders to live like this today. And there are a lot of people even now who are very critical of Luther and his wife for leaving their monastic orders and getting married. And what I usually don't see people mention is that actually Luther was released from his vows appropriately, possibly against his will. And the situation that Katharina was in, where she was pressured into swearing a lifelong vow when she was like 14 or 15, and then being treated like this, like no one in the Catholic Church would say that's okay or that's a binding vow now. And it just shows how
some would, but most of them would. Okay.
not most Catholics I know. Goodness,
Yeah,
I mean, they would be horrified if they heard that nuns were being treated like that.
Same here. Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's a post Vatican II world, but I think even before Vatican II, things had improved a little bit, and it just gave a different resonance to that story. And realizing that when Katharina was in the nunnery, one of the people there who was particularly encouraging to her was the brother of von Staupitz, Luther's former vicar general of the Augustinians, Johann von Staupitz. His sister, even as he had been a mentor to Luther, his sister had kind of been a mentor to Katharina in the nunnery, which makes me realize, maybe that was part of how they what made Martin and Katie kind of feel like they had this common ground with each other, even though their backgrounds growing up were very different. It was like they'd kind of been through the same ordeal, and that probably gave them a strong connection.
Yeah. What I was gonna, James, you were gonna say something? I didn't see.
Yeah, we haven't let him talk, have we?
That's all right.
No,
I'm soaking it in. No, I was just thinking as you were talking, Amy, about the situation in which Katharina was in, that it did sound a lot like prison. But also what's interesting is she was in prison, but then sort of she and Luther found freedom in realizing that their will had been bound, and their will is bound.
Yeah.
So it's almost paradoxical. She was really imprisoned when she was physically imprisoned, but was free when she realized that her will was imprisoned.
that's deep.
Yeah, I mean, that it's the paradox, right? Then Christianity is sort of built on some paradoxes.
Sure.
I always say it's not that they're irrational, but they're paradoxes, like the Trinity. That doesn't make rational sense to us. It's not how things work on planet Earth, but that doesn't mean it's like violating reason. It's just on a higher level. And I do find that another one of these paradoxes is the fact that the more you keep telling yourself, I'm free, I can make good choices, the more you do end up bound. And a lot of those nuns, not only where Katharina was staying, but throughout Germany at the time, there was this real trend to show you were godly by eating as little food as possible.
Yeah.
And there were these women who basically, even Catherine of Siena basically fasted herself to death. And it was this idea you're purging yourself of these desires. And Luther's going to come to this different understanding of God's creation, which is that obviously things in creation can be abused, but they're actually gifts from God. God is not wanting us to live a miserable existence. He actually gives us food that we could eat because he wants us to eat it. Now, can you abuse food? Of course you can, just like you can abuse anything. But, another one, he's much more positive, much more sex positive, as we would say nowadays.
Yeah.
And, you've had Lyndall Roper on your podcast, which I'm, not at all jealous about, but she makes a point in her book that although Luther, some of his views seemed us to be very backward, his views about sex were actually like very positive, we would think nowadays. Now, he wasn't a complete libertine like we've kind of gotten into now, but he didn't view sex negatively. Like, he saw it as a positive thing that God had given to humanity, just like food, just like all the wonderful, the beauty of nature, all these wonderful things we enjoy. God didn't put them here merely to tempt us, but as good things for us to enjoy. That's the situation that used to be in the Garden of Eden. And it's only now, since the entrance of sin, that all these good things are getting twisted and perverted. So I think for Luther, his freedom that he was getting in Christ was also a freedom to enjoy the good gifts that God gives us.
Yeah.
If you think about his hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, the very last verse, it's maybe translated a little differently in English, depending on what you're using. But he says, the Spirit and the gifts are ours.
Yeah.
And this is the idea of a God who's not stingy, but a God who is generous and just prodigal in the grace that he's giving to us. And even though there are going to be hardships in the Christian life, God is giving us the gift of himself. He's giving us the greatest thing that he could give. And all the blessings we have in this life are, just pointing us to that greatest gift that he's giving. And of course, Luther's going to emphasize, and he will die on the hill, that Christ does give himself to us in the sacraments in the most literal way possible. So, and I think honestly, that's why he could never make an accord with Zwingli over that, because to have any other understanding of the sacrament meant that Christ isn't really giving himself to us. He's holding something back. And Luther's thinking, no, you need to give, he's giving all of himself to us. Even as we, whether in marriage or in our relationships, we're to be giving and generous to others. So, and that's, that's why we're doing good works now, Luther would say, not for God's sake, but for the sake of our neighbor. What we've been given, we now are passing on to our neighbors. So,
well, that's one of the things I like so much about Luther's theology is that it's so worldly. And of course, you got to qualify that because, there is this spirit versus flesh dichotomy in Christianity, in the New Testament, and Jesus uses that type of, framing of things, but it can be so taken to an extreme, meaning that matter in creation is bad or something like that. I mean, it's almost like a Gnostic heresy that I think Luther very much saw that tendency in Karlstadt. And I think Linda
Mhm.
Roper, of course, who you bring up, who, yes, we were very grateful to have on the podcast. But both her more academic work, well, her biographical work on Luther is very, I would say, very accessible, but that her more nonfiction take and your fictional take both, I think, emphasize that aspect of Luther's theology, of how I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think him and you have a little spat between him and Karlstadt in the face-to-face book, right? But which maybe isn't centered at least, but touches on that, how Karlstadt thinks he's above things of the world because he's supposed to
Mhm.
be carved out and be consecrated and holy, while Luther sees, creation and things as gifts from God. You know, so yeah, and that's an aspect of Luther I like, because sometimes we get so Christians can get so quote unquote spiritualist. Well, it's kind of like what Luther, what he would have to say, though his views weren't totally unproblematic, but some of his views on when and if to resist authorities, or if soldiers can fight in war, all these kind of ethical questions. um, he didn't resort to just some, withdrawal from the world, or some total pacifism or whatever. Like, the way, I'll just use an example, the way he talks about, like, there are times to turn the other cheek, and then there's times not to, right? Because scripture also charges us to love and provide for our family. And Luther speaks, this isn't correct by today's standards, but he talks of family as possessions, as one's possessions. When we think possessions, we think of something as material and meaningless, and vanity, and but for Luther, when he's speaking of that, he's speaking of, like, the household in general and the well-being of that household, right? So sorry, I didn't mean to digress there, but that's one of the most valuable things about Luther's theology I like so much, is that it's so kind of, yeah, down to earth, grounded, practical, in comparison to to those he would call the enthusiasts, right? My thoughts, but
Yeah, I mean, Luther, by this point, by the point that these two books are set, he's starting to see himself fighting a two-front war, basically, because he has, of course, the Catholic Church that he feels is mixing up law and gospel and having a kind of, therefore, I think he sees having a disordered relationship with physical things as being a key sign that you're somehow mixing up law and gospel,
mm,
because the Catholic Church, at times where you see the greatest abuses happening, it's because they're trying to basically, the mortification of the flesh. It's like Paul's talking about, that this is not actually accomplishing anything spiritually, but when you think you're trying to be saved based on following the law, you do start to go to that, like, severe treatment, severe denial and renunciation of physical things. But then what Luther's seeing is he has all these people on the other side who are basically Anabaptists, or sort of Anabaptist-ish, who are taking a similar approach.
mm,
And, I read some of Karlstadt's writings for my research here, and he talks about we need to be letting go of everything, even like human affections and love. Shouldn't, it's almost starts to sound like, in those Star Wars prequels where the Jedi are always telling Anakin, you can't afford to have any human human relationships or connections because that will be like a weakness or something. And you almost feel like that when you're reading Karlstadt's works, and you just feel like, man, this would not have been a real great guy to know, because he wouldn't have been very pleasant.
mm,
But, and interestingly, Erasmus, who was a man who did enjoy the finer things of life, but he, in his own way, is having, he's under the law, because if you read his writings, he always, yeah, he seems on the outside to kind of have things together on this moral behavior improvement, but he knows that he's not perfect. And you can just sense this underlying anxiety in everything he writes. And the main way it manifests is that he's scared to death of everything that's happening politically and socially. He thinks the both he and Luther thought the world was ending, but Luther was like, the world's ending. Christ is coming back. We're going to be delivered. And Erasmus is like, the world's ending. Everything I've done doesn't matter. This is terrible, And that just shows that now I do think it's okay to be a little nervous about the world ending, even if you do, believe in Christ and resurrection, all that. Like, it is a somewhat disturbing proposition that, things could get very fire and brimstone-ish. But there is just a basic uncertainty in Erasmus's person, as we see in his book of The Freedom of the Will, where he says, although he's arguing for the freedom of the will, he also says, none of us can really know if we have free will or not. The Bible is just too unclear. In fact, we really shouldn't be making any firm assertions about anything. And you see how both, and I would say in our day, both extreme conservative or right-leaning thinking and extreme progressive or left-leaning thinking, theologically or politically, both can kind of bring you back to a law, because the law can be seen in all different ways it presents. But at the most basic root, it's always do more, try harder. Do more, try harder. And anytime you're hearing do more, try harder, that's always the law, regardless of what things someone is saying are the righteous things you need to do. There's always something you have to do. And Luther is saying, nope, it's already been done. And that's why Luther kind of stands in the middle, him and, the other like-minded reformers, in the middle, in the minority, always unpopular, because the people on both sides make up the majority of Christianity even today. And, it's just, usually they're going to point to that and say, well, you're just an antinomian. You don't care about God's commands. It's like, no, it's not that we don't care. We have a higher opinion of God's commands, because we think if you are not perfect, then that is not enough. Most people think, well, I'm pretty good. That's enough. No, you have to be perfect. We have a higher view of God's commands. And that is why we're so relieved that we have this grace that is giving us the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ. And that's the only thing that's going to give you that kind of certainty to actually be doing kind of okay when things are going to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
And I've seen this a little bit the last few years, because there have been some kind of crazy things happening around the world, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And I go on social media and people are just melting down. They're like panicking. And, I'm concerned. I am very concerned about all these things that are happening, but I have a kind of peace and a kind of hope, because I actually do believe God's in control.
Yeah.
And the way, I not only that he's in control, but that he loves me. And that makes all the difference when you're going through your life, because obviously you go through the same hardships, but you have that kind of stability that this is when the rubber meets the road and you really tell what people believe, because we can be hearing the gospel all day, but when we come through difficulties, we see if we're really counting on the gospel or the law to save us.
Well, and also, and this isn't to discount any of that. This isn't to say discount anything about the inner peace that Christians can have, and the way that faith can bring us that. But also, I imagine, this is just me guessing, you're not at all shocked. I don't know, you're not melting down when you see the crises in our world today, because you're a student of history and you know better that there's never been a time in history where that hasn't been the case, which kind of brings me, I know we're getting close to time here. I did want to ask, I did want to get a little bit more in the book, but I did want to ask about the backdrop, because the backdrop of this book is 1525. So you have the major thing going on is the German Peasants' War. Yes, Erasmus and Luther are having this debate, which we definitely shed a lot of light on. And him and Katie von Bora are also getting married, and that was just a really unprecedented, controversial marriage in itself. And we talked a little bit about that, of course, in this episode already. But the big thing is this Peasants' War, these uprisings, this social upheaval. And I want to ask, like, you being a reader of history and being, wanting that connection with people of the past, seeing as that they were flesh and blood like we are, with thoughts and feelings like we have. Like, um, you like to read history, you like to try to put yourself in the shoes of someone in their experience. How did that when you were reading? Because I know you were in it, and I know like when Linda Roper came on the show, you got a hold of me. And it's like kudos. You got Linda. You did say you were jealous, but you said kudos. You got Linda Roper on the show. Love her work on the Peasants War, and of course that's what we had her on the podcast for. So I know you've definitely researched that for this work. Like, what was how did that impact you or move you, or when you were reading about the Peasants War? Because it's such a catastrophic time.
Yeah, and it for anyone who wants to know an in-depth on the history, they should listen to your episode with Dr. Roper, because she'll give a much better, summary than I will. But it's kind of a nebulous changing thing over the course of the year. It starts with really kind of more the peasants are looking to have, some of these injustices they've suffered through the feudal system. They're looking to have those reversed. They're looking to, have better treatment, better pay. Luther actually is supportive of that initially. As it goes on, and inevitably this always happens with revolutions, that more and more people start jumping in and they all bring their own agendas. Mm-hmm. It becomes much more religious. And the key phase is the one that happens the last couple months, is that Thomas Müntzer and some of these sort of Anabaptist-ish people who, to be fair, the Anabaptists you meet now are going to be pretty different than these Anabaptists. But they're basically, it becomes like a doomsday cult. They think the world's going to end, and they're like, sell everything you have, grab your torch and pitchfork, and we're going to they want to completely overthrow the government and usher in the kingdom of Christ. And Munster's theology, by the way, is just wild. Like, don't think that this guy at East Germany presented him as like this great predecessor of communist utopia. No, this guy was completely nuts, and he led a bunch of people to their deaths. But so that's going on, and this is very interesting because this is the biggest popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. It's bigger than the peasant rebellions you see in England during like the 14th century. And I mean, just tens and tens of thousands of people involved. And it gets to this point where basically people are just starting to get butchered, and it's very bad. And I describe in the book one incident that happened in the hometown of the reformer Johannes Oecolampadius that he grew up in, basically, where they just like broke in and slaughtered a whole bunch of people. And Erasmus and Luther are going to interpret this event completely differently. Erasmus is going to look at this and say, see, this is the kind of societal breakdown you get when you preach the kind of doctrines that Luther's preaching. Even if what you say is true, Luther, about the bondage of the will, we shouldn't preach it, because this is what happens. People think that nothing they do matters, where nobody trusts institutions and authorities anymore, and it's just becoming a bloodbath. I mean, he's like exhibit A for why my book was correct. Whereas Luther interprets this as the devil seeking to attack the work of reform by discrediting it. In fact, he sees it in his letters as like a personal attack on him. He'll say, the devil wants to kill me. And that may seem nuts, but Luther has this theology, this understanding of what he calls Anfechtung, which are trials or temptations. And he's going to say, if you're experiencing spiritual depression, anxiety, hardship in the Christian life, rather than being a sign that your faith is weak and you're no good, it's a sign perhaps that you're doing something right and the devil's trying to attack you. And one of the things that does mark out Luther's theology is that he takes the devil very seriously. He believes that, he's like in this kind of individual combat with the devil. And he believes that God is stronger, so none of us have to be afraid of the devil. He's going to say, just remind the devil that you're baptized. And baptism is basically an exorcism. Once you're united with Christ, the devil can't do anything to you. But he does believe that the devil can, in this case, attack his physical body. So as this is happening, it's moving closer to Luther till at one point the elector actually says, you need to get out of Dodge because I can't protect you anymore because they literally are coming to kill you. And so it's just so interesting how the very same thing that Erasmus thinks discredits Luther's theology. Luther sees this as proof that obviously what I'm doing is right because look how the devil is opposing me.
Right.
And it just is very interesting. And I do see some parallels to the present day because thank God we don't have anything exactly like this happening. But in various parts of the world, there seems to be a growing unrest. I think it sort of has its roots in the economic crisis of 2008 to 2009, which had shockwaves around the world. And then again, we had the COVID pandemic. I think this has just created this general feeling of anxiety, inequality. We could get into all of that, but we're seeing a lot more populist kind of leaders coming to the fore. We're seeing people losing a lot of faith in historic institutions or organizations, sometimes rightfully so, because they've become corrupt for whatever reason. And there's just this sense that things that have been going a certain way for a while are suddenly not going that way anymore. And that can produce a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
Of course, every change is always an opportunity. Like the Reformation was a huge, scary change for a lot of people, and we would say it was a good thing.
Yeah.
So, but the Reformation also had consequences that couldn't be predicted. And one of those was this peasants' revolt, which I think it would have happened without the Reformation, but it wouldn't have taken the exact form it did.
Sure.
Because you get that radical theology coming in. Yes. So, yeah, it was very interesting reading about it and trying to figure out how to work that into the book. Because Luther's going and dealing with this at the same time that he's preparing to write this response to Erasmus. And how does what he's experienced in that year impact what he writes about the bondage of the will? And I thought that was a very interesting thing.
That's quite a year. There was a lot written, but those are the kind of the big ones from Luther's works of 1525. Yeah, Bondage of the Will, and then a few. It was 3 or 4 things he wrote addressing.
He did write a book, a pamphlet against the peasants at the very end. In fact, it was so late that most of them were dead before they even would have had a chance to read it. Yeah. But he writes this notorious pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants. And, I read it certainly for these books. I quoted a little bit of it. Mm-hmm. And I think it was very troubling to Philip Melanchthon when he read it. But if you read that, basically what Luther is saying is if people are trying to overthrow the government, you should take up arms to put down what's essentially an insurrection against the governing authorities. Yeah. I actually don't have any problem with his scriptural reasoning in that regard. What I do have a problem with, and I think what Melanchthon and others had a problem with, is there's one particular paragraph where he kind of goes pretty far in using this really violent language about you should, seize them and slay them. And a lot of people saw that as giving free rein to all the authorities that they could just go around and slaughter any peasant. Yeah. I think it's pretty obvious that that's not what Luther's saying, but the argument is people use it as an excuse. In reality, because of the timeline, I think it's clear that most of that had happened already.
Most of it happened already. Well,
and the peasants were also very violent towards those who didn't join.
Yeah.
The summer in May of 1525, there was that massive slaughter. Can't remember the guy who led it, but
it just it's one of those. Sometimes when you're living in a sinful world where people's wills are bound to sin, you get some really bad sin.
Yeah. Well,
and that's what happened in 1525.
I'm relieved to hear you say that you thought Luther's, even including his last pamphlet, but his writings addressing the peasant situation were, for the most part, pretty measured and reasonable. And scriptural. I felt the same way about them. It's funny. I read all of those earlier this year for my academic work, and I sent I sent a Facebook message over to James. He's like, what's everyone's problem with these writings? I've always heard like how this is just like I was thinking something like on the Jews and their lies. I was thinking like a writing akin to that. Just total like vulgar, just word vomit of hate. But I'm like, I don't get that at all. And I mean, at all. Yeah, I really didn't get it. That I didn't read it that way. Um, I don't know. So I'm glad to hear that I'm not crazy. I was,
Yeah, I
maybe we're
think
both crazy. I don't know, but
maybe. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to say that, yeah, some of Luther's other writings are just horrific, and there's absolutely nothing that can excuse them.
Mhm.
I do think that in this case, some of the language is a little over the top, but I think anybody else who wasn't part of the rebellion itself would have been making the same arguments if you look at it in the historical context and understand what the Peasants' War was. Because some people, again, it was different things at different phases. And if you look at the first phase, it looks like a perfectly reasonable presentation of demands in a nonviolent manner. And you're going to say, why do these people deserve to be killed? You have to consider what was happening. This is written at the very end when it's reaching the peak of the bloodshed. And probably he wrote it right after he had learned about that terrible slaughter that had happened on Easter.
Mm.
And because that's the timeline. And I think I kind of get it. And I'm willing to say, yeah, the Philippa Pest thing was terrible. All the anti-Semitic stuff in the 1540s, absolutely horrific. This one, I'm not completely letting him off the hook for it, but I don't think we could have expected him to really do anything else. I mean, because if he had come out and not said something like this, the whole Reformation would have been completely discredited, because people would have said, oh, yeah, you are just a bunch of murderous thugs who want to overthrow the government. So I think he had no choice.
Mhm.
And it was also probably the right Christian thing to do, not to use the language he did, but to make the point that, yeah, you don't have to stand idly by when people are violently, just
Right.
doing vigilante justice. That you don't have to do that. That's not what Christian freedom means.
Right.
So
This is what has always been bothersome to me about how people try to sort of find a workaround from Romans 13 about being subject to the government under whose authority you find yourself. Paul was writing that about the Roman government who was actively killing Christians, like seeking their torture and death. And yet he was still saying that they were to be subject to that government because it was put in place by God. So people trying to find a workaround today, irrespective of their political beliefs, whether it's, the previous administration or the current administration or the next administration, the idea of trying to say, yeah, well, Paul probably didn't actually mean that, I find it very disingenuous.
Mhm.
And I think Luther was probably right in his assessment of what Paul was saying there when he wrote that treatise, although I agree that sometimes he could go a bit overboard with language. But that's also quintessential Luther. Like
Yeah.
he did that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that kind of language at the time as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, it was
Luther
very
was maybe particularly skilled with it, but he wasn't the only one using it. And I will say that Luther, he said no when the emperor told him to stop. When he was told to stop preaching the gospel, he said no to the government.
Right.
So he's not saying that you should just always blindly obey what the government's telling you. But he does say that, if necessary, that, rather than, just taking justice and vengeance into your own hands, yeah, if they want to throw you in prison, okay, that's what's going to happen. And that's what happened to the apostles. So, yeah, I do think it's so hard for us as Americans in the 21st century to get our heads around that. Mm-hmm. We see the government as, basically the government is formed based on our consent and continues based on our consent. Mm-hmm. And we don't see that we have, as much of a duty or responsibility to the government. Mm-hmm. You can err in either direction with that. But I do think that sometimes also people will say that the government is, forcing us to put aside our Christian principles when maybe it really isn't the hill we need to die. Like, yeah, if they, in Luther's case, they really were saying don't preach the gospel anymore. Saying that you have to pay a little bit more in taxes probably isn't a religious affront. Mm-hmm. But Again, I'm getting dangerously political here, so I'll leave it there.
Dangerously, very partisan. Kidding. Before we go, I guess I stole this question from a stock question, but I genuinely am curious.
Okay.
What are a couple things that you would like readers to take away from your new book? Well, I guess both books in a way, because they do go together. But
I would love for readers to take away from this something that the Apostle John says in his first epistle, which is that perfect love drives out fear because fear involves punishment. This to me is a good way to think about the gospel. And in these books, you see people who are dealing with a lot of fear and angst over different things. In my personal life, I've dealt with anxiety, both just in a general human way, in a more specifically medical way. I have absolute sympathy for everyone going through anxiety, but the final relief that, as Dave Zoll calls it, the relief that we get from God is knowing that we're perfectly loved, that we're completely righteous based on what Christ has done, because fear ultimately has its basis in punishment, in the fear that God isn't for us, that he's actually against us. That was what Luther caused. That was why Luther had all that fear for all those years in the monastery. Now, after his evangelical breakthrough, he had a lot more periods of what you may call poor mental, emotional health. But they were a little different because he could always, resist the devil by saying, Christ is for me. I'm united to Christ. I'm baptized. I am righteous. He could keep repeating those promises. And the promises of God are what allow us to withstand the difficulties of life. And just because you are feeling afraid is a natural human emotion that we experience in our bodies. But what are we then going to do as a result of that? Are we going to turn to God and remember his promises and believe that he loves us and that he is our Redeemer and Deliverer? Or are we just going to look inside and keep trying to find the answer here inside? Or are we going to try to deal with our fear by trying to control our circumstances? Because we can't. And that's something you see in both novels, with the characters. And of course, we all see it in our own lives, that the more we try to control everything, the more we realize we cannot control everything. And I hope that people go away feeling, just some relief from that, and remembering that's where our confidence comes from the perfect love of God. And that's what it actually means, that to believe in the bondage of the will is to believe that God is resurrecting sinners, that he is setting captives free, and that he is loving the unlovable because his love creates the goodness that he desires to see. So I hope people take that away.
Amen. Man, excellent. Amy, thanks for, again, coming on the show.
Of course.
I am curious, it's there was a part in the book, I believe, where Luther and Melanchthon are having this conversation, and Luther says something like, Melanchthon brings something up to Luther about how there's people that are starting to disagree with me and argue with me, and Luther says something to the effect of, well, if anyone comes after you, they'll have to deal with me or something. And or something to that effect. Sorry, I don't have it. That's my dog making noise. Both of them making noise. But obviously, for us who know the history, Luther dies, but Melanchthon continues, and he's involved in all these disputes. Is that like a sneak peek for a book 3? Are you going to write about Are you going to write about that, or
It was not intended to be a sneak peek for a book 3, but that scene in particular is kind of meant to contain some little hints at the future. And while I try to make these books accessible for people who don't know a lot about Reformation history, I do try to include some little Easter eggs for people who do. And in that scene, you do see, because of course, this is exactly what's going to happen to Melanchthon later in life. And Luther isn't going to be there to
Yeah.
speak for him anymore.
And if
And
Luther was
yeah.
there, James would say Luther would have stuck up for Flacius against Luther or
Well,
against Melanchthon. But that's James' opinion. No,
we'll
sorry, James.
see.
I shouldn't speak for you.
I will say,
No, I agree.
although I do think there were some differences between Melanchthon and Luther's writings, Luther was willing to look the other way or tolerate certain things from Melanchthon that he wasn't from anyone else.
Right.
So I don't know. It's interesting. But the other thing that you kind of get a little hint of in that scene is the fact that after Luther dies, the whole operation is going to basically get shut down because the emperor is going to show up with his soldiers and say, sorry, you got to shut it down. And they're going to have to, Melanchthon in particular, is going to have to face some really heart-wrenching decisions over what do we compromise on to keep people alive, and what does it really mean to keep the Reformation going. And the other little Easter egg I put in at that point is my idea for actually why they end up surviving when that happens, which is that they've catechized everyone. And not only have they trained all these pastors to fill all these pulpits, but the average people do not accept when they try to reimpose Roman Catholic practices. The average people don't accept it either. And I think that's it's a two-tier strategy. All those years that they're teaching at Wittenberg, they're thinking at any point, they're going to tell us that we can't keep preaching this anymore. How are we going to survive when that happens? And it's just this existential reality that's always in the back of their minds. Every time they're teaching students, every time they're grading papers, to the extent that they did that back then, or, judging a disputation. Every young man that's coming through there is they're, passing the torch. These are the people who are going to have to keep it going after we're gone, or when we get killed, because Luther expected his whole life he might get killed, as did Melanchthon. So that is an interesting scene for me. It's one of my favorite scenes in either of the books. And I will tell you another little Easter egg. In that scene, they're both sitting on the spot where they're going to be buried.
Oh, is that in Castle Church? I missed that part. Yeah. Well,
it's not, there's nothing that would be obvious about it, but you'll see it talks specifically about Melanchthon they're up by the altar, and Melanchthon sitting on the left and Luther sitting on the right, and that's exactly where they're still buried.
Wow.
So in that scene, I was thinking forward to the rest of their lives and their legacy. So yeah.
Well, excellent. Amy, again, thank you. And if you do write a book 3, we'll have you on for that. And if not, I'm sure we could find some other topic to you could talk about.
I would not be entirely surprised if another book came along.
I don't want to give you the pressure. I can edit this episode.
Oh no, you're not pressuring me. I would not be surprised if someday another novel came along.
Sure.
We'll see if the Lord allows.
Yeah.
It might not be exactly the same topic, but
just make sure Flacius is the main character.
I'm sorry, but there are some things even I can't do in terms of making people likable. So
yeah.
But,
anyways, thank you. God bless
so
y'all.
much, guys, for having me on again. I enjoy talking to you.
Yes, thank you. And God bless, and blessings to our listeners, and we'll catch y'all next time.